Sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Iti piso bhagava aramam samma sambuddho. Vichashana samano sujato bhagavato anuttaro purisattamma sarati sattade manusana buddho bhagavati swakato bhagavata dhammo samnitiko vandhariko evasiko otaniko bhajatatam vedato viduniti supatipanno bhagavato sangho Udupatipanno bhagavato sangho Nyayapatipanno bhagavato sangho Samicipatipanno bhagavato sangho Yayapachatari Visayani Antavisampukara Esa bhagavato sangho Ameyo, Ameyo, Dakineyo, Anjalikariyo, Anuttaram Punyahedam Lokasati. Been on time together for the last 10 days and having the very unique privilege to be able to spend time together practicing Dhamma and to spend time in such a beautiful place and such supportive conditions. And I know that samsara is like, all suffering and all of that kind of stuff, but sometimes the suffering can be nice. It's nice to be able to suffer with a group of nice people and to be able to support each other to move forward in our Dhamma practice. I think I've learned a lot from this retreat, and even though I haven't been able to practice so much with all of you, but in some ways sharing space and sharing your voices and It's always something that gives me a chance to learn as well. This evening, I wanted to talk a little bit about wisdom. And obviously, wisdom is a topic that has come up throughout the retreat in one way or another. And I touched on some of the key issues this morning. I talked about the distinction between the wisdom of learning, the wisdom of meditation, and the wisdom of realization or insight. And I also talked a little bit about how in Buddhism we have special meditation approaches or emphases that we can learn to help develop wisdom. And I mentioned also this morning about the 3 stages of insight, or a handy way of thinking about 3 stages of insight, which is in terms of, first of all, knowing something as it is, then knowing something as it's impermanent, etc., and knowing something as something that's been let go. And we did a very short meditation on the senses, just looking at the eyes and the ear and seeing the 3, the sense organ, the sense stimulus, and the sense consciousness, which all comes under the first of those 3 stages of insight, is the knowing things as they are, rather than we hadn't got as far as seeing them as impermanent yet. Anyway, so that's more or less where we're up to. So one thing that's fundamental in Buddhism is that wisdom is, like when we use the word wisdom in English, it's a very general term. In fact, it's so wide that it hardly has any meaning, really. But in Buddhism, we talk about wisdom as, usually we're translating the Pali word panya. We might just as well translate it as understanding, perhaps. But in any case, we usually translate it as wisdom. And it's not something that is as vaguely defined and nebulous as the concept of wisdom is usually in English. So in Buddhism, wisdom has particular characteristics, it has particular ways of developing it, and it has particular functions. Whereas normally when we talk about wisdom, we just think, oh, somebody is wise. It's almost like a mystical quality that somebody has, that they're wise, and that somehow this wisdom emerges from them in a kind of mysterious way. So in Buddhism, we would say that that's to do with the faculty of wisdom, or the potential of wisdom. So different people have different potentials of wisdom, maybe because of their past karma or their practice, or for whatever reason. And I think we can all see that different people have different, the nature of the wisdom that different people have is different. But it's also, I think, fairly obvious that it's not really possible to quantize that in any meaningful way. So in Western psychology, they have this rather notorious idea of the IQ as the intelligence quotient, which is a kind of a way of quantizing wisdom. Not really wisdom, but intelligence, but it's not really intelligence. IQ is a great way of quantizing specifically that which the IQ test is quantizing. Whatever that is, and not particularly useful in my estimation. Wisdom's not something that we can quantize, but it is something that we can develop. It's something that we can intuit. It's something that we can it's something that we can realize its potential. So wisdom in Buddhism, I think, is a lot more intentional and a lot more active than either wisdom or even intelligence is usually considered in Western psychology, where it's more or less that's what it is. So people will say, "Oh, that's what your IQ is," as if that's something which is fixed. Of course, the reality is you take your IQ test before and after drinking a cup of coffee, and you're going to get very different results, and doesn't really tell you anything fixed about yourself. So wisdom encompasses a variety of different kinds of cognitive processes. It includes rationality. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about rationality because rationality is, I think, often misunderstood and disparaged within the Buddhist world. Long story short, if people are teaching you not to think, then they're probably starting a cult. Just a heads up there. That's one of the red flags for any kind of religious cult, is that it tells you not to think, not to ask questions, not to know stuff for yourself. And of course, there are many kind of notorious examples of this kind of thing happening. When a spiritual teacher tells you don't think, what they mean is, have my thoughts, not your own. When they say don't have any views, they say have my views, not your own. When they say don't be attached to your opinions, what they mean is be attached to my opinions. So reason and rationality is a faculty. And the Buddha employed this faculty, and he used it to make logical arguments. And he used it in discussions with people. But the way that the Buddha used reason has a number of characteristic features. First thing is that the Buddha used reason empathetically. And I think this is really important. When he was in conversation with people, the Buddha almost invariably would begin by establishing something in common with that person. Or at the very least, by sort of engaging in what they said in a constructive way. We saw that in the Dandapani Sutta, where the Dandapani's attitude was a bit brusque and a bit aggressive, and the Buddha still responded by trying to sort of jujitsu his way around, like not directly confronting Dandapani, but just kind of bringing him around to maybe help him to try to reflect on it. So to begin to use our power of reason with empathy is one of the signs of wisdom. A number of years ago, probably 20-something years ago, the Dalai Lama was invited by a Christian group to give a commentary on certain Bible passages. And they chose like half a dozen passages from the Gospels, and they gave Mr. Dalai Lama for his reading homework. And they said, "Oh, can you please give us a talk on these passages?" Interesting idea, right? And when it's published as a book, which it's a good, nice one to read, and they chose some fairly controversial passages. Like they didn't choose just like the nice bits as well, you know. they chose, like one of the passages they chose was when Jesus was with his disciples, and his mother came, Mary came with, I think, his brothers, and then said, "Hello, I'm your mum. When are you coming home?" Something like that. I can't remember the exact gospel passage. And Jesus said, "Oh, this is my family now," and he talked to his disciples. I mean, it's kind of hardcore passage, right? It's kind of challenging. And so the people who chose these passages did so because they wanted to get something interesting, right? And the person who invited him afterwards gave a response to the Dalai Lama's comments, and he said that it was he could see that His Holiness held all of those passages very gently and responded to them with empathy. Rather than using them as a point to criticize and attack, which of course His Holiness is very highly intelligent, obviously, and very highly skilled in philosophy. If he wanted to use it to attack or to belittle, then he could easily have done that. And that, to me, is one of the signs of wisdom. That wisdom is used gently, is used empathetically. It does not mean, of course, that there's no role for criticism and that there's no role for distinguishing what's right and wrong and so on. But it means that those things should be done judiciously and carefully, and that we don't engage in political debate. Sorry, don't engage in religious or political debate, for that matter, simply for the point of view of being right. It's a kind of, there's a hollowness to that kind of approach. And it's something I see very commonly, people doing and people engaging, a lot of people on the internet who engage in this kind of way. So few people seem to listen, really. It's kind of sad. Anyway, so we use reason to clarify things, to distinguish what is in line with the facts and what is not in line with the facts, to eliminate certain classes of wrong views or wrong beliefs or wrong ideas, and to help to point our way towards the truth. Now, at the same time, the Buddha said that reason is sometimes right and sometimes wrong, which, okay, seems obvious, but there's a whole history in Western philosophy of this idea. Actually, a large part of Western philosophy for a long time would disagree with that. And they would say that if your reason is wrong, it's because you're not reasoning correctly. Nothing problem. Reason itself is perfectly capable of finding the truth. And if you're not finding the truth, then you need to look more closely at your reason, because something must be wrong with it. The problem with this kind of idea is that it depends on this idea that reason has some kind of abstract or absolute claim to truth. But reason itself rests on evidence, rests on knowledge, rests on what you've seen, rests on what you believe. And all of those things are approximate and vague and ill-defined. So we can never actually really reason with 100% confidence. So that simple statement of the Buddha is, I think, still true today. Reason is sometimes right and sometimes wrong. Which doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't rely on it. It just means be aware. Sometimes it's going to be wrong. So we shouldn't be attached to it. So this is one of the problems with reason. Another problem with reason is that even if it's true, it still doesn't actually help you all that much. I mean, you might be right. Great. Life goes on. What difference does it make? Actually. Yeah, or maybe you worked something out in your head, or maybe you persuaded somebody, or maybe you've, solved some problem. Okay, that's fine. It's good. But if that's all it is, then it doesn't really matter. So I mentioned before that there are parallels between the way Buddhism does things and the way science does things. So this is another area where there's a parallel. So in science, someone like Einstein can figure out in his head, purely by himself, using his own reason, that E equals mc squared. When I say purely in his own head and by himself, what I mean is in discussions with his wife, who then gets excised from the theory later on. But isn't that always the case? And then they will go on and test it. Kind of wild, actually. Like Einstein predicted that light bends in the presence of gravity, so that you should be able to detect that. And then they detected the light passing the sun, the light of a star passing the sun. And you could tell that the light actually bent when it passed the sun, according to these ideas that Einstein just thought up in his head about science. I mean, it's wild when you think about it. How can you come to such clear and precise knowledge of things about the universe just by thinking about it? And so in science, your thought or your hypothesis is always tested by the evidence, tested in experience. And of course, that's what we're doing in Buddhism as well. You might believe everything's impermanent, or that everything's not self, or that everything's suffering, or whatever. Maybe you believe the opposite. Maybe you think everything's permanent and happiness and self. Great. Try it out. So this is where our vipassana meditation comes in. Now, in the 20th century, vipassana meditation became this whole thing. It wasn't really a thing before. Like vipassana was something that you developed, and you develop wisdom through your meditation. But I don't know if you had vipassana meditation techniques. Certainly didn't have vipassana meditation like schools and methods and retreats and books. And these days, everything's inside this and inside that. Now it seems to have been replaced with mindfulness this and mindfulness that. These things go through fashions. But the focus on vipassana in 20th century Buddhist meditation, to my understanding, is largely a sociological phenomenon, specifically a reaction to colonialism. So colonial powers went into Buddhist countries, invaded their countries, stole their riches, and sent missionaries in to convert everybody, denigrate their understanding, denigrate their religion, their practices, their philosophy, and tell everybody that your religion is just superstition, it's just black magic, it's just idol worship, and so on and so forth, and it's not really worth anything. So the Buddhists responded. The response to that colonialist critique is what we call Buddhist modernism. The Buddhist modernism is basically the movement of reformed Buddhism that appeared throughout the 20th century. And if you're wondering what Buddhist modernism is, basically it's every kind of Buddhism that you're likely to encounter. Pretty much. Unless you go and stay in some mountain in Bhutan or something like that. because everything that we see has been developed in response to the encounter with modernity, even at levels that we don't really think of. I mean, just a simple example would be, say, the robes that I'm wearing. The colour of these robes, the jackfruit dye and so on, these are characteristic of the Thai forest tradition. The Thai forest tradition began as an outreach of the reform movements in Bangkok, of the W movement, which was started by King Mongkut, who got an English language education and was exchanging letters with the Pope, and was a thoroughly educated modern man who, by the way, didn't believe in rebirth and wanted to reform Sangha to make it more modern. And so following that, then various reform movements were started, among them the forest tradition, started dyeing their robes this colour, and then that kind of spread. Traditionally, robes would usually be like saffron colour, light orange colour. I'm not sure if they were using this colour before or not, but it was certainly standardised as this colour later on. So all of these details that we see, that we think, oh, that's just Buddhism, that's just how it is. In fact, these have a history. And often that history is not that old. And most of those things we can understand as modernist Buddhism, that is as a response to the challenges of modernity. And so one of the things that the Thai forest masters did was that they started practicing the meditation practices that were taught in the Pali canon, in the Pali texts. And this wasn't always the case. In Thailand, a lot of people were doing like tantric practices. You have like a chant they call the Buddha Pandara Sutta, where you're basically chanting and invoking different meditation states and arahants to inhabit different parts of your body and so on. It's wild stuff. They're doing all kinds of things. If you travel around Thailand even today, Thailand's one of the most unreconstructed forms of Buddhism, actually, for whatever reason. But in Thailand, there are lots of completely wild teachings and practices and meditations all over the place, which you wouldn't know anything about because they've never been written down or put in any books or anything like that. Thai Buddhism is very creative. Don't think that Thai Buddhism is just like boring old Theravada. No, it's not like that. And so all of these arise out of that encounter with modernity, when we need to find a way of practicing Dhamma which is going to be relevant and meaningful for the times that we're living. And so one of the things which these Thai forest tradition monks and nuns emphasized was the importance of developing wisdom. So rather than doing meditation to make like psychic powers or to be able to do cool stuff like predict the lottery number, then they were more into like making your mind peaceful and then seeing things as being impermanent. I know, a bit boring comparatively, but that's how it went. And so meditation was empirical, psychological, rather than mystical. Same thing happened in Myanmar, except even more strongly, because Burmese Buddhism tends to emphasize like the method more. Thai Buddhism, they don't really emphasize the method, they more emphasize the lifestyle. Anyway, so in Burmese Buddhism around the 20th century, Mahasi Sayadaw and various others, Ledi Sayadaw and so on, started developing these meditation methods that were were based on their interpretation of how to practice vipassana, that is, to how to develop meditation, how to develop wisdom and insight through meditation. And many of you will have done Mahasi retreats or Goenka retreats, which are probably the two main practices that emerge from that. But there's a lot of other ones as well. And but they're the two main ones that are well known overseas, especially. Anyway, so all this is a bit of a digression But my point really, it's a bit similar to the point I made a few days ago near the beginning of the retreat when I talked about how our approach to our meditation is shaped by the words and the ideas that we have about meditation. The same way our ideas about insight and wisdom are shaped by the words and thoughts of the people who created these meditations and their experience and so on. And they emphasize practicing in certain ways, leading to certain kinds of results. So I guess my main point here is that there can be many ways of developing wisdom. And in the suttas, we find countless ways of doing that, as we do through the Buddhist tradition. For example, one story in the commentary talks about how a monk was going for alms round, and as they were walking through the village on alms round, they heard a slave woman singing a song about the sufferings of life. I mean, it's the blues, obviously. So then he reflected on that and thought, oh yeah, life is suffering, and then got enlightened. So officially, according to Theravada, you can get enlightened by listening to the blues. So there are the insight that we get comes from these contemplation of impermanence and suffering and not self and so on. But the manner in which that insight occurs is honestly quite mysterious. I think I mentioned before in the Theravada tradition, you have a long series of insight knowledges that sort of give you a sort of scaffolding for understanding. Other traditions have other systems for that as well. But the reality is that the appearance of insight is mysterious. So when we do meditation, and even when we do vipassana meditation, what we are really doing is laying the groundwork for the insight. That's why I'm not really happy with the idea, with the translation of vipassana as insight, because insight usually means like a moment when you see what is real, you see the truth. Whereas vipassana meditation is really about doing the work to lay the groundwork that's making it possible for that insight to occur. The meditation itself isn't actually insight as such. I mean, that's a small semantic difference, really. But anyway, to me, that's quite significant. So we can do our meditation. We looked briefly at the meditation on the 6 senses, and we can focus each of them, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, then take our time with each of those senses, right? Get to know them really well. Get to know them in and of themselves. What is seeing like? What is the eye like? What are sights like? What's eye consciousness like? And the more we go down that road, the more these things become a bit obscure and a bit nebulous. Like an eye is pretty straightforward, okay? Sights, also relatively straightforward. Eye consciousness, starting to get a bit hard to see, hard to know. You can't see eye consciousness. What do we know eye consciousness with? That's interesting. What do we know eye consciousness with? So the more you spend time with these things and the more you gradually get to know them, then the more mysterious they become. So to me, this is one of the signs of real insight. Insight isn't about like mastering a curriculum where you can get a bunch of facts and then mark them off and say, oh yeah, I've got that one, I've got that one, I've got that one. That's not what it's about. Actually, the further you go into it, the less you know and the more mysterious everything is. Even I'm sure each of you on your retreat have probably experienced this. For example, when you have a painful feeling in your body. You know, you maybe have a pain in your back. And you're sitting there, your back's painful, and then you focus on that painful feeling for a while. And you'd be like, oh, it's really painful. It really hurts. And then you focus on it. And you stay there for a while. You're like, sorry, where is that pain? And you go like into it. And it's like, actually, it isn't even there. It's weird. And like the closer you look at it, the less there seems to be to it. And so a lot of these things have that kind of quality where they are actually, the more you look at them, then the less they are in some way. You could say that the closer that you observe something, the more it reveals its empty nature to you. So our living in a world of solid things is a sign that we are not perceiving emptiness. We're not perceiving conditionality. And the longer we stay with them, the more empty they become. So when we start doing this meditation on the senses, our experience starts to fragment a little bit. So you can do this analytically by just like focusing on one particular sense, breaking that sense down, and then comparing one sense to another. What is hearing like compared to seeing, compared to smelling, right? But you have to take your time with each sense to really get to know it very well first. And of course, to do that, then you want to have good samadhi. So the better your samadhi is, then the deeper your insight is. And then you're starting to watch these, and the world becomes weirder and weirder as you do this. And the more you get to know it, the odder it seems. And you begin to realize that actually, like this world of solid things and concepts and ideas that we live in is it's all interpretation. And, you know, I'm sitting here talking, you see me. No, you don't see me, you see light. You hear me talking. No, you don't hear me talking. You hear sound. You have an idea in your mind, Bhante Sujato, where you've mashed together the sight and the sound, and you've got this idea, and somehow that means something to you. And if you sit there for long enough, you can learn to cut those things off from one another and see them quite separately. So there's a sight and there's a sound, but they got nothing to do with one. Weird. And you realize how much work that your brain is doing all the time, your mind is doing all the time to process, interpret, and build up a world that is coherent and makes sense. So in meditation, we can stop doing that. Right? Now, this also is another one of the reasons why from the beginning of the meditation, I think if I remember correctly, from the very first day of the meditation, I said beginning, middle, and end. You know, meditation has a beginning, middle, and end. Because in your meditation, you can deconstruct the whole world until there is nothing there but a pile of rubble. And then that pile of rubble burns into dust. And then that dust turns into atoms. And the atoms sparkle into energies, and the energies disappear into nothingness. And you'd be like, whoa. And your meditation ends, and you can get up like normal, pick up your meditation mat like normal, walk out of the room like normal, and be like a normal person. You're not a normal person, not anymore. But you can act like it. Right? Again, beginning, middle, and end. This is how we wrap up our meditation and we keep it safe so that we can give ourselves the confidence to be able to go as deeply as our meditation goes, meditation wants to go, without being afraid of where it's taking us, because we know it's going to come to an end. The Buddha compared the six senses to six animals. The Chapana Sutta is one of my favorite ones. So the eyes, I'll see if I can remember them all. The eyes are like a bird, I think. The eyes like a bird? No, I think the eyes are like a snake.
Yes, yes.
Eyes are like a snake. Why are your eyes like a snake? Eyes are like a snake. The eyes are like a snake because your eye is aki and a snake is ahi.
Yeah,
It's a pun. And your ears are like a crocodile. Also a pun. Sumsumara is crocodile in Pali, and it sounds similar to the word for ear. I think your nose is a bird for fairly obvious reasons. Your mouth, I think, is a dog. I think the mouth might be a dog. And then your body, I think maybe a jackal. Can't remember all of them. And your mind must be a monkey, right? So all of these are like different animals. So what we do, like normally what we call a person, right? A person is where you get a snake, a crocodile, a bird, a jackal, a dog, and a monkey, tie them all up together and dump them in the middle of the street, and then just sit back and watch the entertainment. And the bird tries to fly up into the sky, and the snake tries to slither into a hole, and the crocodile tries to go into a river, and the jackal tries to go into the charnel ground. And everyone's having fun, struggling against each other. And the more you meditate, the more you realize it's like all of these senses are like these completely different things. They're kind of arbitrarily combined because that's just what we happen to have evolved, I guess. I mean, it kind of works okay, right? I mean, senses are great, actually. Senses are incredibly refined and subtle. It's kind of weird that they work okay, even though they're so arbitrary. So we can go through and we can deconstruct these senses. We can see how each one of them works. Then we can see how each one of them stimulates a response, right? So it's not just how the sense works, but it's how the sense makes a response, craving, liking, disliking, right? How we're interpreting it. So when we learn how to see that sense consciousness as it is, so you see sight as that's just light, once you've learned to see that, then you can ask yourself, oh, how am I interpreting that? You see, normally we can't ask ourselves that because all we see is the interpretation. We've got no idea what's going on behind the scene. So we're starting to learn about what is going on behind the scene. So it's a bit like we've been like watching television or something like that, and watching all the stories and getting caught up in the stories. We think we know about television because we know about what's on and what's not on, what's good, what's not good, what makes you laugh, what makes you cry, all of those things. And we think we know what television is. And then somebody buys us a screwdriver, and we take the back off the television set, and you have a look inside. And you think, I had no idea. I just thought there were all these little men and women who were running around having all these adventures. And now I realize it's all this wiring and chips and mechanisms and coils, all this stuff. So this is what we're doing, is we're breaking things down so we can see how it works. So all of these things we talked about in the Madhubindika Sutta, these are all things we can investigate and reflect on in our meditation. Take your time, slow down. Don't have to do it all at once. You can do like one sense in one meditation. Heck, you can do one sense for a long time. Slow, 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 slow. Get to know things really well. Compare them. Pair these different senses up, look at how they relate to each other. And then you start to see the meaning of impermanence. Because impermanence doesn't just mean that things change. I think I mentioned the The same Ajahn Chah said that we said that this cup is broken already. And this is like a really important insight into the nature of impermanence. Everything is anicca dhamma, it's like its nature or its liability is to be permanent, it's to be impermanent. What this means is that if we come back to these six sense meditation, the I is always changing. Eyes are impermanent. I mean, the impermanence of eyes happens at multiple levels. It happens on a like we can open our eyes and close them, or we can look in one direction or another direction. So there's a kind of intentionality to that. But it also happens unintentionally when, say, we go into a more intense light and the eye will close up and the pupil will close up or it will dilate. So this is another sort of level of impermanence. Or the way the light strikes our eye will happen in different ways depending on the visual conditions. Eye also changes on a more slow level because the eye gets older as you get old, and then sometimes you need glasses, sometimes your vision fails, and so on. And even on a more sharp level, more small level, because the eye is making constant adjustments and changes much faster than we can consciously be aware of. And so at every level, the eye is changing. And of course, the eye changes on a bigger level when we get born and die. And that's very impermanent when our eyes get burnt up in the cremation fire and there's nothing left. Unless we're one of those arahants who gets burnt up in the fire and the only thing that's left is their eyes. Have you heard of those ones? I think there's one in Singapore, if I remember rightly. They go and get the cremation upwards and there's these two eyeballs left.
No.
You'll have to check it for yourself. I can't vouch for it. I wasn't there. It's just a story I heard. Yeah. Should see. I'm actually going to be going through Singapore in a few days, so I might just check and see if there is one. If there's any on displays there, I can go and see them and just check them out for myself. Okay. Moving on. So that's impermanence happens at all of those different levels. And so it's happening at multiple different levels and multiple different scales all the time. So impermanence, just with your eye organ, is already happening in complex ways that we are only really partially aware of. Like we don't normally pay that much attention to it. Like we might occasionally, walk out into the sun and go, oh, that's bright or something. Or you might occasionally think, oh, my eyes are getting not so good and I need to get my glasses checked or something. But most of the time, we don't really think about it. It just is. We just look and we see. They're pretty good, actually, eyes. All things considered, right? Anyway, so then sights also are changing. If we're sitting here now, we're sitting in a room which is fairly still, right? Not too much changing here, but people moving a little bit, few things changing. So that field is changing, but also the way we pay attention to that field is changing, like we're moving our perception, or maybe the focus is changing, or maybe what we're paying attention to within that field of sight is also changing. So those things are changing as well. And then, of course, eye consciousness then is changing because of all of those things. Eye consciousness can be more intense or more dull. Like, for example, you know what it's like. Let's say if you're just waking up in the morning and you can sort of feel your eyes kind of opening and then just things dimly coming back into consciousness. Right? Whereas if you're maybe going bird watching and you're sort of really kind of focusing to try and see, oh, what kind of bird is that? Or you're really sort of focusing and putting that attention on your eyes. And then your eye consciousness becomes much more sharp. So all of these things individually are changing all the time. They're all impermanent in multiple different dimensions. Each one is impermanent in multiple different dimensions. And then they have to relate to each other. And then the relationships between them also are changing constantly in multiple different dimensions. And the relationships between one sense and the other are also changing, because each sense is also impermanent in the same way, in that multi-dimensional way, where the ear is impermanent, sounds are impermanent, ear consciousness is impermanent, ear contact is impermanent, ear feel, all of these things are impermanent, and all of the relationships between them are impermanent. That's a lot of impermanence, right? And when you start to contemplate like this, you begin to realize one of the fundamental truths of impermanence, which is that permanence is a construct. Impermanence is just normal. We build up, we have what we call Nietzsche Sanya, the perception of permanence. And we build up in our mind the idea of that person is there and they're still there and they continue. And this is an idea in our mind. And these constructs are complex. And because they're complex and they're dynamic, because the constructs of them are themselves changing. Like the construct of permanence is changing. Like you might think that somebody is permanent, like we normally think. Heidi is permanent, more or less. But our inner perception of Heidi is also changing. Each time we see her or talk to her, that's also changing. So the construct is impermanent. Even the construct of permanence is impermanent. Yeah? And so these multiple levels of impermanence are constantly falling over, constantly collapsing, constantly crumbling away, tottering, falling to bits. And we're constantly having to shore them up, to plaster up the cracks, to fill them up, to keep them going. Yeah? And our perception of permanence, of the world that makes sense and is stable and relatable and meaningful, that is something that we maintain through a lot of effort. In fact, that's most of what our minds and our brains do, is construct this world around these ideas. It's a bit like in the Netherlands, and you've got all the dikes holding the seawater back, right? And then when there's a crack in the dike, you need to get a little boy to put his finger in it to stop the water coming through, right? Sorry? Doesn't work. You put your finger in. I mean, especially with climate change, you're going to run out of little boys in the Netherlands. I mean, they've got to go to school sometime, right? So there you go. Actually, got to have like shifts. And we constantly have that energy. See, and this is one of the meanings of dukkha, is that it means that we constantly have to use energy to create this world of useful illusions, which we have made for ourselves. And that takes a lot of work. And you think about what happens when you have to change that illusion, right? For example, what happens if you think of somebody as something and they turn out to be something else? Yeah. That's hard. Yeah. Maybe someone in your family, maybe your friend, maybe it's like an artist who you love or something like that. Maybe you brought up as a punk. I know we've got a few punks here in the audience. And then you find out that Johnny Rotten now is a Trump supporter. And you're like, now my whole world is shattered. And you have to change that. And it actually takes work, right? It's emotional. And you have to change build a new construct of the world that somehow makes sense. So this is where you're constantly doing this in our thought process. All of those thoughts that are happening in your brain, right? All those thoughts that are happening in your mind, all those thoughts that you just dismissed as being useless, distracting thoughts, right? That's what they are doing. All those thoughts are the activity of your mind to construct your world, which creates the illusion that you're going to live in. So when we start to break down this world, all those illusions start to crumble. You start to see through them. Can be very disturbing. Can be very emotional. You can break down and start crying. Can be hilarious as well. You can just start laughing. So a couple of people have to leave to get a taxi. Bye-bye. Very nice to have you. You are also impermanent. But we love you anyway. Now, in this talk, I've been talking about impermanence, but it could be one of the other avenues of insight as well, suffering or not self. Classically, these are the three that they talk about: impermanence, suffering, and not self. For myself and my own meditation, impermanence has always been the primary sort of avenue for developing insight. But of course, these things are always linked and they're always very close together. So it doesn't really matter. Traditionally, in Theravada, they traditionally say that this is a matter of personality. So different people will use these different modalities according to their own predilection. So it doesn't really matter too much. Ultimately, they all contain each other. So the impermanence is one thing, but there's also the relationship between things. Things don't just disappear and they're not just arbitrary. Impermanence doesn't mean randomness. Impermanence means relationship. Impermanence means that there are connections between things. So something isn't and then it is. But the fact that it is has something to do with what was. It's strange, if you look into your mind, it's strange how knowledge just seems to pop into it. Don't you think it's weird? I think it's weird. I'm a Dhamma teacher, if you hadn't noticed. That's what I kind of do. And I go around and I do talks about Buddhism and stuff. But I can sit here and look into my own mind right now. I can't see anything about Buddhism in there. Like, I just look in my mind, I'm like, there's just nothing there. Like, where is all that stuff? It's weird, isn't it? When your mind is quiet, you look into it, there's nothing there. I'm sure I must know things because I sit in this chair and I talk and words come out. They seem to make sense. But where is it? I don't know where it is. And like I could say something, right? For example, I could say pink camel. See, now you've got the idea of a pink camel in your mind. It wasn't there before, and then it is. And you can visualize a pink camel. Or I could say, like, what's 5 plus 2? And as soon as I say that, you're sitting there going, been a long time since high school. 7, right? And I don't know if we got any we had a couple of mathematicians on the last retreat, so they were able to help out with that one. So it was good just to confirm that. But it's funny, like it's not, the answer isn't there, and then it is. And you say, where does that answer come from? And people say, well, it was in memory, or I worked it out, or something. But these are just rationalizations. In your experience, there wasn't anything, and then there was. The idea isn't there, and then it is. You're talking to somebody, and then you don't, they're saying something, and then you're listening, and then you say something. Where is that beforehand? You just say it. Somehow it's not there, and then it is. It's weird, right? I feel weird that we go around in this world where we've got actually no idea how our minds work. One of the characteristics of insight is basically how Buddhist insight works, is leveraging this idea, this fundamental basic fact of insight. Simply put, insight arises from intuition. And the quieter and the more spacious your mind is, the deeper the insight will be. And the most quietness and the most space you can have is samadhi. So this is why when your mind comes out of samadhi, it's at its most powerful, at its most bright, at its most clear, at its most open, and that's when the deepest insights will come. And they'll come randomly, and they'll come in some mundane way. Maybe you turn off the light and you go, that's it. Maybe you walk down the street and suddenly it comes to you and then you're just crying and laughing while you're walking down the street because everything is so obvious to you. It could be while you're listening to a Dhamma talk or doing some meditation, but very often it isn't. Because at those times, there's still kind of a subtle expectation. There's a kind of subtle work about, I'm doing this. Yeah. And sometimes you can let go of that and then it will come, it's true. One of the famous examples of that was Venerable Ananda, who had been with the Buddha for 45 years. It just reminds me, I think we didn't actually finish the honey cake discourse, did we? Did we finish it? No. We didn't finish it. Maybe, no. No. So after Mahakachana finished talking, the monks went back to the Buddha. Bao told him what happened. He said, Mahakachana clearly explained the meaning to us in this manner with these words and phrases. And the Buddha said, Mahakachana is astute mendicant, he has great wisdom. If you came to me and asked this question, I would answer it exactly the same way as Mahakachana. This is what it means, and this is how you should remember it. When he said this, Venerable Ananda said to the Buddha, so Venerable Ananda was the Buddha's attendant and probably his nephew, so probably related to Dandapani. And Ananda said to the Buddha, so suppose a person who was weak with hunger was to obtain a honey cake. Wherever they taste it, they would enjoy a sweet, delicious flavor. So I'm very lucky. I live in Little India in Sydney. And so people give me Indian sweets, which of course I take very mindfully as a reflection on this particular sutta. I'm eating my gulab jamun and I'm thinking, yes, this is like this teaching. In the same way, whenever a sincere, capable mendicant might examine with wisdom the meaning of this exposition of the teaching, they would gain only joy and clarity. Sir, what is the name of this exposition of the teaching? Well, then, Ananda, you may remember this as the honey cake discourse. That's what the Buddha said, satisfied. Venerable Ananda approved what the Buddha said. So this is why it's called the honey cake discourse, because wherever you taste it, you enjoy a sweet, delicious flavor. Okay, sorry I missed out that, but anyway, I managed to finish that. So anyway, my point was that Ananda, I'll come back to this in just a second, let me just finish this story, otherwise I'll forget this story as well. So Ananda was a stream enterer. He obtained the first of the 4 stages of enlightenment, first of 4 stages of enlightenment, but was not fully enlightened until after the Buddha passed away, practiced very diligently, still didn't realize the Dhamma, and then decided, oh, I'm just going to have a little nap. Lay down just as his head was about to reach the pillow, then he became enlightened. Yes, very, very cute, right? It's very sweet. But just remember, you have to do all the practice stuff first. Otherwise, the pillow method doesn't work. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, so you said it took 3 days with a translator, okay, and it takes 5 without. You said it took 3 days to do the honey cake with a translator before you started.
Right.
And now it took 5 without a translator.
Bloody hell. Getting longer every time. Yeah. Thanks for pointing out our imminent mortality. Yeah. Okay. Yes, so I was pointing out, I was talking about how insight arrives in these arbitrary ways. And so this again refers to these 3 stages of insight, which I talked about at the beginning. So the first stage is to know things as they are. So this is when we're looking at like, what is the eye like? What is the ear like? What is ear consciousness? And all of those things. And we're trying to get the clearest idea of the specific and particular qualities of that particular thing. Right? Then we're looking at the general qualities of them as impermanent. And we look at them as impermanent in multiple different levels. Impermanence isn't reductive. There's not like one final level of impermanence. Impermanence happens in a fractal way, in different dimensions and different levels all the time, no matter how you look at it. And so this is the second level of insight, is the level of scrutiny or reflection. And then finally, the level of letting go. Now, when you're practicing insight meditation, that reflective awareness of what's going on in your experience can often manifest or can often deepen into some kind of transformation or illumination or intuitive awareness. So, and that can happen in all kinds of unpredictable ways. So the course of samatha meditation, the tranquility meditation, which is what we've been doing most of the retreat, and doing metta meditation, and that's leading to a relatively predictable outcome. The course of practicing is not really predictable, but the outcome we're leading to is that coherent state of mind of metta, and we're aiming to realize that coherent state. But in vipassana meditation, it's not quite as simple as that. And so things will break up in all kinds of different ways. And so you can be sitting there and meditating, and then suddenly the whole world just drops away. The floor disappears, everything goes, and then you're just sitting there alone. Or maybe you're sitting there meditating, and then your body becomes empty, and the air is just blowing through you, and everything is just going through you, and there's nothing solid about you at all. Or maybe you'll be sitting there and you will see a thought, and you'll see the thought disappear and just be impermanence. And you'll see this thing which you've seen thousands and thousands of times before, but you see it for the first time. And you actually see the impermanence of it. You actually see that one thing in the act of being impermanent. And it can shake your whole world, because you realize you've never actually seen impermanence before. So that transition from like reflection and scrutiny of these things to actual insight in them can happen through all of these different ways. But ultimately, what matters is that it manifests in terms of letting go. So how that works is through the union of 2 different dimensions of knowledge. Now, in Indian philosophy, all Indian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy, including all schools of Indian Buddhist philosophy, there are 2 primary modes of knowledge, which are direct perception and inference. So direct perception or direct experience is where you just see the thing itself, the raw data of the senses. So I talked before about, for example, your eyes see light. That's it. That's your raw experience. Yeah. So sound, smell, taste, and touch. And the things that your mind knows. This is the raw experience of your mind. That's called pachaka, which means like something which is directly visible. And then there are things which are inferred. Insight requires both of those things. And I think this is something that is not really understood or not really taught a lot in modern times. But again, I think this is a modern innovation because it's not really justified in any traditional schools of Buddhism which talk about these two means of knowledge. So, for example, I can see a sight. Great. Can I see the impermanence of that sight? Yes, you all know me well enough not to answer now. You know it's going to be a trick question. Not really a trick question. Can you see the impermanence of the sight? No. You can't see impermanence. You can see a sight, then a bit later you see another sight. But you're not seeing this sight change into another sight. You're just seeing this sight and then another sight. If you want to see impermanence, then you have to remember that your sight was previously something else. So this is memory, and it's based on comparing one with the other, and that's based on inference. So to see impermanence, even at that very basic level, requires an inference. It's not something you directly perceive.
Sorry, it requires what? I couldn't understand.
Inference.
Inference, okay.
Yeah, inference.
Another word for it?
Inference, another word for inference.
Translation.
Inference, translation into what? General? Do we have a Dutch translation of inference? Inferentie. Not necessarily reasoning, right? Reasoning is a form of inference, like reasoning uses inference. But if I see this there and then that there, I'm not really reasoning that this was here and then that it was there. Inference is much more immediate. Yeah. Same thing, like even if I see a cup, right? So there's kind of inference involved there. I actually see light, and inference tells me there's a cup. And that might be mistaken, of course. It might be a hologram. Or they could have put some LSD in my coffee earlier today, and it doesn't really exist. Maybe you don't. Do you exist? More or less? Beginning to become less certain of it as time goes on. Is that good? Do we have a translation of inference?
ChatGPT.
Sorry.
That's in very poor taste. Right? No, but seriously, is there a translation of inference into Dutch?
There might be. Deduction.
Deduction, yeah.
To infer.
To deduce, yeah. Similar to deduction, yeah.
Maybe that's the thing that follows, therefore, like, I think therefore I am.
Right,
So the inference is the thing that follows therefore.
yeah. Something like that, yeah. So that's when you like express it in like an explicit and a logical form, then that's what's happening. But of course it happens at an intuitive level and a precognitive level all the time. Yeah? So inference doesn't have to be logical. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Yeah? So inference is what Sherlock Holmes has that we don't have. Right? He walks into the room and he sees the shoes out of place, and there's a mud mark by the window, and the second son has a scratch mark on his left cheek, and therefore concludes that the butler did it. Right?
It's actually connecting the dots.
Connecting the dots, yeah. Yeah, inferring. So we infer that things are impermanent. We certainly infer that all things are impermanent. Right? You can never see that all things are impermanent because you can never see all things. Yeah.
Do you know those illusions where what you see suddenly changes into something else?
Like a perceptual illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Donald Altman, who is a scientist who created the scientific philosophy around the case against reality.
Uh-huh.
He was also at a talk with the Dalai Lama
Uh-huh.
at quantum computer inventing Italy a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And he gives a lot of these illusions that shows where your perceptual system falls apart,
Right.
where you actually observe the moment that it collapses
Right.
and moves into a different visual perception.
Right.
So it's not necessarily always an inference
Right.
when you're trying for this moment to occur. And
Right.
it's a very peculiar, amazing moment to have that
Yeah.
effect.
Yeah. Yeah. What was his name again?
Donald E. Hoffman.
Donald E. Hoffman.
Ja, als je vraagt. Nee? Dat kun je doen als je vraagt. Dat Hofstede.
That's Hofstadter.
Hofstede.
Yeah.
Somebody else to Margaret.
Margaret, how's it going, Margaret?
Die zegt gevolgtrekking.
Margaret says for wolf trekking.
Translation things.
Is that good?
Yeah.
I think so.
Dutch response.
In Dutch, yeah. Thank you, Margaret. That's very helpful. Yeah.
Another word would be afleiding.
Afleiding.
It's a literal translation from the Latin.
Okay, so we're good. So understanding requires both direct experience and inference. Now, here's how the equation works. Basically, your faculty of wisdom refers to your power of making inferences, right? So that's why Sherlock Holmes, super smart guy, could make an inference on a very small amount of information. Just see a little bit and then make the inference. Yeah. So the stronger your faculty of wisdom is, then the quicker you'll be able to make an inference from the least amount of data, the least amount of information. But the weaker your faculty of inference is, then the more data you need, the more information you need. That means the more time you spend on the meditation mat practicing, the more suttas you have to study, the more Dhamma talks you have to listen to, the more life experiences you have to go through that are going to really test your understanding, because that's also really important. Yeah? So all of those things will be giving you more information and deepening your wisdom, deepening your wisdom, deepening your wisdom. That's why some people, if their faculties of wisdom are very strong, then they'll be able to maybe just hear one teaching or do one simple meditation for a short time and already have a deep insight. And then for others, then we have to laboriously go bit by bit by bit. It doesn't matter how fast you go, just as long as you keep going. I mean, it's better to go faster, but it doesn't really matter as long as you keep going. So, so this is how the meditation on the samatha and vipassana meditations work together. Because the samatha meditation, by creating a whole mind where all the parts of the mind are working together, and where your mind is clear, the functions of your mind are working well, the hindrances are gone, all of those things are happening, and then will allow your faculty of wisdom to flower brilliantly and swiftly and easily. And so there are some kinds of meditation where they say, oh, you don't have to do samatha meditation. You can just do that together with the wisdom. It's a bit like a 2-in-1 shampoo and conditioner. Never quite works as well as doing them two separately. So the deeper that your samadhi goes, then the deeper your wisdom will go. But once you have that wisdom, once you can see impermanence, once you learn to let go, then it will be easier for your mind to find peace. So that the samatha supports vipassana, the vipassana supports the samatha. Tranquility supports insight, insight supports tranquility. And they both go together. From the point of view of early Buddhism and the Buddhist suttas, this is always the way. All of the different parts of the Buddhist path are always working together. They're always supporting each other. They're always friends to each other. So always be a bit cautious when somebody's telling you, oh, you don't have to do this, or you don't have to do that, or that's not so important, or this is not so important. That's not how the Buddha taught. The Buddha said, do everything as best you can. He wanted you to aspire to do as much as possible, not to do as little as possible. So the power of wisdom manifests because through that insight, through that one knowing, then everything is known. That's how the inference works. Once I see impermanence, I know everything is impermanent. And once we know everything is impermanent, we can start to live in the world as it is, rather than the world as we imagine it to be. I mentioned before about how sometimes in insight meditation, things can fall apart. Things can just be empty. Things can be completely deconstructed, even dysfunction. These are temporary states. And this is these should be wrapped up. Normally at the end of the meditation, you go about your life. Somebody who has a true insight into the Dhamma, who's realized it's one of the stages of enlightenment, doesn't sort of go around, seeing everything as being impermanent or these kinds of things. They just go around normally. But they know that it's impermanent, so they don't get attached to it. They still use the word I, and they still open doors, and they still say, hello, friend. They don't say, hello, 5 khandhas. It's like being normal. But you know that everything is impermanent. And when you know everything is impermanent, you know something very important, and that is how precious it is, how precious life is, how precious every person is, how precious it is to be able to practice, how precious it is to be able to be kind. The Buddha said that if you knew as I knew the importance of giving, you would never eat alone. You would always be looking for somebody to share your food with. If you knew as he knew the importance of giving. And to me, this comes back full circle to that connection between wisdom and empathy, or wisdom and compassion. And so for the Buddha, it was not like, oh, I'm so wise, you guys don't have a clue, right? And it wasn't like, oh, I can see, I can see like dependent origination and emptiness, and I've got all these great theories and stuff like that. So I don't have to bother with these little things like generosity. It's the more that his wisdom was deep, the more that he saw how precious and important all of these things are the smallest act of kindness. How important that is. And I'm just going to finish this with one story. I'm just going to give you one of my favorite stories, which is a little bit to do with that, not really, but a bit, but good enough. Why not? And so this is a story of a monk called Upagupta, who lived about 100 and something years after the Buddha, about 100 years after the Buddha. And he had practiced, he'd become enlightened, was the most famous teacher of his age and was regarded as being the second coming of the Buddha, who would like turn the wheel of the Dhamma. And he thought he lived such a blessed life, but he only had one regret, which is that he'd never seen the Buddha in person. And he came from the declining age when things were not as good as they were in the old days. And he heard that there was a bhikkhuni who was still alive, who'd been alive in the time of the Buddha. And she was the oldest bhikkhuni in the world and the oldest member of the Sangha in the world. And he was so thrilled when he heard this, that there was still somebody alive who had met the Buddha in person. And so he really wanted to meet her and ask her about what had happened. So he went to see her and he went to her hut and he opened the door to her. He knocked on the door and she said, "Come in." He opened the door of her hut. She said, "Careful, there's a bowl of oil just next to the door. Be careful you don't knock it." And so he tried very carefully to open the door, but as hard as he couldn't help but just knock the bowl of oil a little bit and spill a bit of oil on the floor. And he said, "Oh my goodness, Venerable, I'm so sorry." And she said, "Oh, never mind, don't worry, we can clean it up." Anyway, so they talked and he asked her about whether it was true that she'd been alive in the time of the Buddha. And she said, "Yes, it's true." And he said, "Tell me about it. It must have been amazing." She said, "It was." "Where did you meet the Buddha?" She said, "I met him on the road to Kusinara. He was just about to pass on his time to Mahaparinibbana, full time to passing away. And I was living in a little village there. And I was just a little girl. And the word came around the village that the Buddha was coming. And we knew that the Buddha was going to come past our house in the morning. And people were saying that the Buddha had already predicted that he was going to be passing away soon. So we knew this was going to be the last chance we'd have to see the Buddha. So everybody was so excited. Everybody's running around, kneading the chapatis, cooking up the curries, chopping the chilies. They didn't have chilies in those days. Anachronistic. Chilies are American. What? Yes. Shocking, I know. Chilies are American. They have peppers. Anyway. And everyone getting ready for the Buddha coming along. And then the Buddha came to their house and they gave some food into his bowl. Everyone was so happy. And she said that, I was just a little girl and I bowed down to the Buddha. And when I bowed to the Buddha, I had a hairpin and the hairpin fell out and it rolled under the couch. And I couldn't see where it had gone. And I loved that hairpin. So when it rolled under the couch, I started crying. Where's my hairpin gone? And the Buddha bent down and picked up my hairpin and he gave it to me and said, "Here's your hairpin, little girl." So he said, that's what I remember of the Buddha. When Upagupta heard that story, he was like so full with joy. He was so amazed to have a teacher who was so kind. And a teacher who had been so amazing and so profound, and yet for him to show that simple kindness to a little girl was just amazing. And he said, "Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu." And then he asked the bhikkhuni, he said, "What about the monks in those days? Like the Sangha must have been amazing. There must have been so many great monks." And she said, "Yes, there were." She said, "Tell me about them." She said, "Well, in those days, the monks were like really mindful." She said, "Like, you've heard of the group of 6 monks?" He said, "Yeah." And the group of 6 monks were like the worst monks in the whole Sangha. They were like the bad boys at the back of the class. If there was trouble to be found, the group of 6 monks were there. In the Vinaya, the monastic code, there's lots of rules which were laid down because of this group of 6 monks. That's how we know about them. And she said, that group of 6 monks, they were so naughty and stuff, but, the Sangha was so good. Like, even those monks, even that worst monks in the whole Sangha, even they weren't so unmindful as to spill my oil. Anyway. Not sure what that's got to do with the talk, but anyway. So anyway, do we have any questions before we wrap up for this evening? Yes, Pedro.
So we have been doing metta meditation.
Yeah.
And now we're talking about vipassana.
Yeah.
So now we go off retreat. How are we connecting them in our daily practice? Or how are we not supposed to connect them? So I understand that we're going to connect them somehow, no? Or not really.
Yeah, I could have talked more about that, but basically, let me just talk a little bit about that. So when we do metta meditation, we begin with "May I be happy." So actually, metta meditation is directly connected with the contemplation of not self, rather than the contemplation of impermanence. And so we begin with "May I be happy," and so there's an I there, and okay, that I is going to be happy. Great. Then we're going to go "May a loved one be happy." So then there's another. So we're kind of extending our sense of self from ourself to another, right? But that other is still someone that we're attached to, right? We still have that love for. So that's fine. So then we go to a neutral person, and then we're extending that sense of self again to somebody that we don't really care about that much. And then to the disliked person, we're extending it again to someone that's disliked, and then to all beings. And so then at that love, which began with ourself, is now for all beings. So in a sense, we've dissolved those boundaries between self and other to all beings. And the love for all beings is very close to not self, because all beings is just a little bit different from no beings. It's just like a slight shift. So, but what we're doing is we are dissolving our sense of self, or not necessarily dissolving it, but expanding it and making it more subtle and more rarefied as we go on. So when you can do that, then the insight into not self will flow very nicely. Yeah? So this is one way that you can do that. But generally speaking, just the best idea would be whatever kind of practice that you're doing. It's good to do some of the practices and some vipassana practices. Don't do just one or the other. Do both. In the Meghiya Sutta, the Buddha taught the monk Meghiya and gave him 4 practices: mindfulness of breathing to quieten down the mind, metta to overcome pain, contemplation of the body to overcome attachment to the body, and contemplation of impermanence to overcome the idea that I am. Yeah? These 4 meditations. And so I think these are good a spectrum of practices to do. You probably might want to focus on one or other at a particular time, but at least try all of these a little bit and find a rhythm that's going to suit yourself. Okay. So,
I was trying to do the Vipassana meditation,
right.
And I found it very difficult. How can I see the mind as impermanent? I found it very, very difficult to see the mind as impermanent, because it's not like the other organs that we can locate, and because we can locate, we can see that they're impermanent. But the mind, because we can't locate it, it's I couldn't. It was not possible to see as impermanent.
Okay, so the question is that the other sense organs are more readily locatable and hence perceptible, whereas the mind is hard to locate and hard to see as impermanent. Yes, exactly. Right, that's the point, right? So what we do in meditation, you always start with something simple and move towards something which is more complex, more subtle. So this is why we begin with contemplating these senses, So the more we contemplate these senses, the more that's preparing our mind for contemplating the mind. If you come to the mind, right, go through the 6 senses, come to the mind, and if you're like, what? I can't even begin to get a handle on it, that's wisdom. That's telling you that your clarity of insight is not there for seeing the mind yet. So you come back and develop the insight on the 5 physical senses. So it's a combination of both developing your insight on those 5 physical senses and deepening the mind through samadhi. So the deeper your mind goes into samadhi, it's actually the samadhi, the realization of samadhi, that reveals the nature of the mind to you. Yeah, at a deep level, because the 5 senses stop, and then there's just the awareness of the mind. And then you start to get some really profound insight into the nature of the mind. Yeah. So just do your best and see how you go. And it's like, again, like in science. In science, a non-result for an experiment is a result. And it's actually just as valuable as an actual result. So don't neglect the value of a non-result. Yeah.
But just a little bit confused about, I think you said that the best insight usually is conjuring samadhi, right?
Or arises from samadhi, not inside
Right,
samadhi.
because you also gave some examples when insights in plain mundane situations.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, so samadhi is the best ground for insight, but it can happen anytime, yeah. And but yeah, that's the normal kind of path, yeah. Love you.
I was wondering about contemplating the senses. Can you do this in all kinds of postures, or is it
Sure.
only in
Yeah, no, contemplation of senses is good to do in different postures, especially to do like if you're doing walking meditation, to do like the 5 senses, then that's good. Yeah. Yes, Maria.
I didn't understand. Let's take the nose consciousness, for example.
Yes.
Does the nose consciousness elaborates the perception of smells? Like,
Yep.
so it has already with the contact.
Right.
If there's the nose senses fragrances of a flower.
Yep.
And it identifies as a rose, for example. So the mind doesn't do the elaboration of.
No, the mind does that part, yeah. So the mind does the perception, yeah. So the nose will just smell a smell, but your mind will recognize, oh, that's a rose. So that's perception.
So the nose consciousness by itself does not identify.
It just knows what it is.
It knows.
It just cognizes what is, yeah, the smell, but it doesn't know what it is.
So it will like recognize, like it will like recognize it's a nice smell, or
the feeling reaction is then a response to it. Yeah, so feeling happens again in your mind. Nose consciousness just knows smell.
well, let's take a taste then.
Okay.
Tongue consciousness recognizes acidic, for example, or not.
It recognizes that taste, that experience of that taste, but it doesn't recognize that it is acidic.
It doesn't label it.
It doesn't label it, yeah. So it recognizes it feels the acidic nature of it, but it doesn't say, it doesn't know that it is acidic.
I can't see the difference, but it's okay.
If you walk into the room, then maybe I catch a glimpse of you walking into the room, and I know I can see you walking into the room, but I haven't recognized you yet. I just see, oh, that movement of that thing, and then I recognize, oh, that's Marion entering the room. So that happens at a separate stage.
And
Looks like it's still not entirely clear, right? But don't worry about it. It's again, it's a matter of contemplation, deepening of wisdom and deepening of insight. There'll come a moment when you're practicing your insight and you'll see it and you go, oh yeah, that's what that is. And you'll actually see that sense experience divested of that perception clearly for the first time. And you're like, oh, it's incredible. I've never actually heard anything because my hearing has always been wrapped up in all of these perceptions and ideas and feelings and emotions and all of that stuff. And that's what sound is. Yeah.
I have another question.
Go on.
Same subject. When you said like the five senses are arbitrary, what do you mean by arbitrary?
The five senses are arbitrary. Well, we don't have a radio sense, for example. We don't have a Wi-Fi sense. We don't have infrared. Like we can have all kinds of cool stuff. Right? Maybe we will one day. We can put a chip in our head and have Wi-Fi. It would be terrible. Yes, imagine that. It'd be great. We can put a chip in our head. We can have Wi-Fi. It'd be so handy. You know what the next thing would be? Our head would be filled with like pop-up ads for pizzas and things. Yeah, man.
Like with the Metta meditation, there's like a list of don'ts. And
Right.
any list of don'ts for this contemplation for the insight, or is it just whatever feels right?
Yeah, good question. So this is a list of don'ts for the insight meditation. Okay, so don't do insight meditation. Insight meditation is counterindicated for people who are suffering from afflictions of identity, particularly, or whose identity formation is not healthy, right? So this is like people who have maybe had some kind of arrested development in childhood or something like that, also have some kind of personality disorder, which is stopping them from being a fully realized person. And so there are different kinds of ways that can happen. Sometimes these can be clinical conditions, or sometimes it might be like a subclinical condition, but it might be just like somebody is perhaps like you know that thing that you go through when you're a teenager, where you kind of find who you are, right? And you find, oh, this is the kind of music I like, and this is the kind of clothes I wear, and you know, these are what my friends are like, and so on. And you form your sense of self from that. And fairly often that doesn't really work all that healthily. And I think this is a broader kind of conversation, but I think I think that traditional societies would prioritize like doing like initiations and so on in order to create that and to support kids to find themselves and to have that healthy sense of self. Whereas these days we tend to more throw that onto the kids and say, find yourself. Okay. Well, there's a lot of options out there as to what it might be. And so often I think it's a real struggle to actually create that kind of healthy sense of self. And so a lot of people, I think, get into adulthood without ever really knowing that. And again, as I mentioned before, with say compassion and empathy, I say that a lot of the times in spiritual circles, a lot of people in spiritual circles are kind of overly empathetic. Actually, we could even understand that as being one kind of this thing, is that somebody who's overly empathetic. But same rationale applies that in spiritual circles and meditation circles, a lot of people come because they want to find themselves, because they don't know who they are. And if you get somebody who doesn't know who they are, and they come to a spiritual circle, and you say, you're not anyone, and you need to contemplate not self, and they go, okay, and they go away and contemplate not self and rip themselves to shreds, yeah, that is not healthy and highly counterindicated. So definitely don't recommend certainly intensive Vipassana meditation for somebody who's like that. Doing a bit now and then is not a problem. But generally speaking, that's why you focus on developing metta, developing breath meditation, until you feel that healthy, whole sense of self inside yourself. I am who I am. I can feel that metta. And, you know, when you're doing the metta meditation, so many people, like if you're doing, may I be happy? And then you feel all these things come up. You know, who am I? Why should I be happy? I don't deserve to be happy. All of that stuff, right? And it's really important to resolve that stuff and to get through that, through the metta meditation till you feel happy and whole and healthy and all of those things. Then you're ready to accept those hard truths of impermanence. Yeah.
Talk about impermanence and myself. What about the I am left to judge myself, and I will do now, and I will don't have an or should I do that, or when, how, because of the aspect of suffering. You could say most of our comes, we should not focus on suffering, but more on, you know, that things like you said, the preciousness of life, or importance of things in
Sure, yeah. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that these three characteristics, impermanence, suffering, and not self, that they're obviously they're connected, but the particular emphasis or avenue that you choose is personal, right? And different people tend to come across those in different ways. So like for myself, impermanence has always been the main avenue that I've done Vipassana meditation. And someone like, say, Ajahn Buddhadasa, the great Thai monk, he always focused on not self. Ajahn Chah also focused on impermanence a lot, right? So if you look at, say, Ajahn Brahm's avenue to insight is dukkha, suffering. So that's why he talks about happiness all the time. You see? It's all a con. He wants you to be happier you can be, then the more he's going to talk about suffering. Not a con exactly, but not either. Right? It's like the flip side of that. Like when you see happiness in everything, then you can also just see the flip side of that is suffering. Yeah, and you can hear that in Ajahn Brahm's teachings when he talks about that. Like one of the things I always remember from Ajahn Brahm's talks, that he gave a talk on dukkha one time, and he said people say dukkha means unsatisfactoriness or something like that. He said, what a load of rubbish, it means suffering. Suffering. And like he's really happy that everything's suffering. Right? Fills him full of joy. And he's not afraid of it or trying to minimize it or trying to explain it away. Yeah. And this is why you can see that difference in wisdom and difference in insight. That people who don't really understand suffering are trying to kind of explain it away. Oh, it's not really suffering, it's more like unsatisfactoriness. It's more like stress, you know? And of course, these are all different aspects of dukkha as well. It's not entirely wrong to say that. Right? But it's not necessarily that it's even wrong to say that, but it's about the courage that you have in facing dukkha. Actually, dukkha is like really painful. And if you have the courage to face that boldly, then that's where that insight will come from. So who should practice dukkha insight? Happy people. Right? And even like not self, you know, you see like Ajahn Buddhadasa practice, he always talked about not self and so on. But you could see he was such a confident character. Like he knew exactly who he was. And so he was very happy to talk about not self. So monk, actually the same monk who I mentioned the other day, who had been the former Arahant in Sri Lanka. And he said to me one time, he said, if you want to know suffering, so if you want to know permanence, you have to know impermanence. You want to know suffering, you have to know happiness. You want to know, not self, you have to know self. Samadhi. Ali.
What would you about non-verbal meditation? And sometimes we watch outside or in the darkness, and we hear the crackling. Now we hear
Right.
fire.
Yep.
Sometimes it's outside and have the waves. And you think that the impermanence of the image of the fire, but it's fixed. You don't know how to just there is something,
Right.
and the crackling that fills you with also impermanence and
Yeah.
the sound of the waves.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's possible to reach that state when without having it as a goal, just
Sure, yeah.
just out of the mood.
Yeah.
Sometimes the mood stays silent
Yeah.
a lot of time.
Yeah.
I think it's possible to reach that state of not even wanting to reach that stage.
Yeah, yeah.
Without goal.
He's asking whether you can contemplate and then realize impermanence without even wanting to, for example, by watching a fire and seeing that. Then yeah, sure. Because these things are characteristics for how the world is. So those characteristics actually make themselves known to you. And remember what I said right at the beginning, that when the perception of permanence is hard work. You see, so the perception of impermanence comes when we simply relax our attempts at keeping everything permanent. So when you're in that kind of state, and the fire is a really good example because you can sit in front of a fireplace and just sort of contemplate that, and it draws you in, and there's like a sense of peace and relaxation because you're not trying to achieve anything or anything like that. It has a drawing power. Actually, all the elements have that power. If in like the first pages of Moby Dick, Herman Melville talks about that with the water. It's a very beautiful passage about everywhere you go in the world, you can see people just drawn to the water. They just want to stand beside the ocean or stand beside the lake, and they just makes them feel happy, makes them feel peaceful. And so that when you feel that relaxed and happy, peaceful state, the mind starting to relax and let go. And then you don't have to do so much work to uphold that permanence. So you start to relax, and then you start to see glimpses. Yeah, you can see impermanence. Let's wrap up about now. And I want to, that's our last talk for this evening, and it's also the last talk for this evening. I think it's the last talk for this evening. Last talk for this retreat. Also my last teaching in Europe. After this, I'm going to England, which of course is not Europe. That's very clear. And so tomorrow we'll have a question and answer and discussion session in the morning. So I have time for all of your questions. I don't know about that, but anyway, some of your questions. Yeah, I just wanted to say once more that I am so grateful for your presence. I'm so grateful for your attention. I'm so grateful that so few of you fell asleep during the Dhamma talks. And just to, we talked about impermanence and how precious these things are. Just to remember how precious it is to have each other and to have this group of people. And we're living in a world where everything is so fragmented, everything's being torn apart, people are being torn apart, everyone's being mediated by machines instead of just by humanity. And apologies to people on Zoom. And especially after COVID, and like even like religious and spiritual communities all broken down by COVID, and the fabric of society and the fabric of connections between people have been so stretched thin. And I think this is really terrible, actually. And I think we've seen, like many people can see, like after that time, that everything seems to have got a bit harder and colder. And like, you know, the decisions and things people make seem to be a bit crazy. And I think we kind of forget, yeah, there's a reason why, because we were locked in a room for a few years and everyone went mad. So there's that. And so here we have a chance to heal, and a chance to heal and practice together. And so I just want to just acknowledge that, and hopefully that you will reflect on that and to understand how profound that is, that we can come here and share a spiritual space together. Do you have a question?
I have a question, yes. I am very curious. I didn't really want to ask, but if you are already at the subject of mobility and ocean, I would like to know where they are all around the poles with the water.
I'm sorry?
She asked me about the poles with the water all around. Like, I think it's a symbol of something.
Oh, the
in
bowls of
Tibetan.
water.
Yeah,
It's
it's Tibetan.
Offerings, yes. Offerings of water. Everything has a meaning.
That's what
Everything.
it has.
Yeah, I don't know what those meanings are. Yeah, generally speaking, but yeah, I mean, I would love to find out actually myself, but maybe tomorrow we can see if there's anyone who knows about that stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway, okay, let's finish by paying respects.